Is this on? Yes, it is. Welcome, everyone. It's a pleasure and an honour to have you all here. My name is Cam McCracken. I'm the director of the Dunedin Public Art Gallery, and it's a real privilege for me to act as the MC for this service for Gary today, and indeed for the gallery to be hosting this event. Gary was a great friend and supporter of the Dunedin Public Art Gallery and many of the team over the years. He was our friend. He was an artist that we showed. We were really interested in him. You've all got a copy of the catalogue of the exhibition that he, the survey exhibition that he and Justin Payton worked on in 2003. And he's also represented in our collection. In welcoming you this afternoon, I'd like to acknowledge and welcome Marjorie and the rest of Gary's family, his wider circle of friends and people that were close to him. This is our opportunity to come together to share memories as well as our admiration and love for Gary. You've got an order of service booklet, and you will see that we have a list of people that are going to share memories and speak, and there's also a slideshow. So that the afternoon flows in a nice way, what I'll do now is I'll run through the order of service with you. I won't jump back up and down and introduce people. They can come up one by one, but I'll go through who's speaking in a second. And after that, there will be an opportunity for anyone that feels like coming up to the podium and sharing any thoughts or feelings that they have. So, firstly, I'm going to hand over in a second to Anna Blackman, who's going to share a timeline of Gary's life. Barbara Galland will then come up to the podium and speak about Gary's medical career and read a tribute from David Green. Then Janet Blackman is going to share a poem by Anthony Thwaites. Paul McNamara will speak about Gary's photographic practice, and I believe after that we'll have a little slideshow of some of Gary's work. Then Anna Blackman will come back up and read a tribute from Charlotte Paul. And then Janet Blackman will come up again and speak about Gary as a father and husband, a family man. So you haven't come here to hear me speak. There are much more important people. So I'm going to hand over to Anna as the first one of those. Kia ora.
Thank you, Cam. So first of all, I'd just like to say a huge thank you to you all who are here, both in person and virtually, and to those who might actually be watching the recording in the future as well. We all really appreciate your support and interest in Gary's life. So I'm going to give you an overview of Dad's life, and I'm actually indebted to Dad for leaving us some detailed notes of the main events and milestones. I think he compiled the notes in the early 2000s. So John Gary Blackman was born on the 24th of December 1929 at Nurse Ross's on the corner of Elm Row and Arthur Street to Lance John Blackman and Erna Ellen Fountain. Dad said several times that he thought Erna rather liked the film star Gary Cooper, hence the use of Gary as his name for every day. Little brother Roger was born on the 5th of December 1933. The family lived at 21 Marquis Street in a brick bungalow built for Lance and Erna soon after they married, and now occupied by only the second owners. Gary attended the North East Valley School from 1936 to 1942. and his childhood life sounded carefree to me anyway, as Gary and his friends roamed the valley, seemingly without the kind of supervision parents give children today. A smoky fire was set to smoke the neighbours' freshly hung washing. Innocent passers-by were shot with the Buck Rogers gun, which I think was a spud gun, and there were trips to the pictures on Saturdays to watch the latest movies. The Blackman grandparents and great-grandparents lived nearby, and there were cousins, the Stewart family, of mainly boys over the fence. The Fountain grandparents were not far off in Port Chalmers. Lance worked in the valley at Fur Dressers and Dyers as technical manager, and Erna taught piano in the front room. Dad very much enjoyed art, and in 1941 he began to attend Saturday morning art classes at the King Edward Tech and was awarded the Technical College Otago Art Society Prize in November 1945. Between 1943 and 47, Dad attended Otago Boys High School. He had enjoyed his studies and did well, gaining a number of prizes and also the Ladies' Cup for shooting. He had a bit of practice at the family crib, shooting rabbits on the hill behind the crib down at Waipuna Bay near Aramoana. In December 1947, he returned to school following the exam break to carve his name in a desk. There was no formal break-up that year because of the polio epidemic. In 1948, he started study for a BSc in chemistry at the University of Otago. This was with a view to eventually joining Lance and Uncle George Stewart at Fur Dressers and Dyers in North East Valley. Artwork continued also as Gary was employed by the Otago Museum in January and May 1949 to paint a plaster relief map of Otago and Southland featuring plant cover, rivers and lakes, towns, roads and railways, but also old Maori travel routes. About this time, Dad started to take photos using one of Lance's cameras. Later, he commented that two images were interesting: some rocks on the harbour shore and another of the Leith. The public library was a source of reading, but also inspiration from exhibitions of Colin McCann and Tost Wollaston's work. And a drawing by McCann of Three Marys at the Tomb was purchased in 1948 when Gary was 18 and was a lifelong favourite. And this drawing was donated to the Hocken in 2020, and you might have noticed that in the slideshow that was playing when you came in. Between November 1949 and 1950, Dad worked on a National Forest Survey job surveying in the Whirinaki River area of the Uraweras. The group was isolated deep in the bush for weeks at a time, shooting deer for food and lugging enormous packs of supplies in from time to time. Dad would show me the scar on his thumb he gained at this time. He had cut it badly with a slasher, and it was mended with sellotape. He often told this story. He obviously really enjoyed this trip. He took several films of the trip, and photography was now a habit that he would not lose until the last few years of his life. In 1951 to 52, the Christmas holiday was spent as a roustabout for a shearing gang at two properties in the Pigroot Hyde area. A series of photos from that time have become recognised for their documentary vision of the backcountry and its people, and several of these prints are currently being acquired by the Auckland Art Gallery. In January 1952, Dad made a more conscious attempt at a photographic essay with a series of photos of a gorse fire near Mount Mira in North East Valley. And one of these images, children watching a gorse fire, is one of his best known. But the others in the series make a wonderful group, and Dad later reprinted and printed more of them in 2002. During the late 40s and early 50s, tramping was a frequent pursuit with friends and family. Several alpine climbs were made with cousin Neville Fountain, and Dad recalled these trips with obvious satisfaction. One trip in August 1952 included Mum, a home science student with a knack for baking cheese scones, and I believe that Dad rose early in the morning to cut wood for the wood stove at the hut, and Mum baked scones for breakfast. In 1953, Dad began working full-time at Fur Dressers and Dyers Limited, but he also worked on completing his MSc thesis. And in March 1954, Dad was appointed Assistant Lecturer in Pharmacology at the Department of Medicine at the university. Mum and Dad married at Knox Church in Christchurch on the 2nd of April 1955. Mum made her wedding dress, as a good home science student should, and it was pale pink silk with a lace overlay and looked gorgeous. Dad was in a double-breasted suit, not really his usual style, and he looked a little uncomfortable but very happy. Janet was born on the 24th of March 1956, and Dad's photo album of the time is filled with photos of the happy, beaming Janet. Such a proud father. 1957 brought sadness as Dad's brother Roger died as a result of a motorbike accident near Kaikoura, aged 23. On the 5th of January 1958, our brother David was born. There were more changes in 1959 as Dad was appointed a lecturer in pharmacology, but was almost simultaneously offered an ICI fellowship at the University of Edinburgh. And he chose to take the fellowship. So the family left Dunedin and travelled to the UK aboard a ship. Mum's wedding dress was recut and dyed to become a cocktail dress for the shipboard parties, and Janet and David were entertained with plenty of organised children's activities, so perhaps Mum and Dad had some little breaks from parenting two small children. So Edinburgh became something of a second home for Mum and Dad, and also for Janet, and some lifelong friendships were forged at this time. The family returned to Dunedin in 1952, Dad to a senior lectureship in the Department of Pharmacology at Otago. And then I was born on the 25th of October 1963. At this time we lived in a small rented terrace house in Adam Street with a rather attractive street frontage, and Janet and David attended Arthur Street School. During 1965, Dad and his friend local architect Ted McCoy started planning a house for us at 23 Braveview Crescent, and we moved in 1966. Dad had actually toyed with the idea of studying architecture earlier in his academic career, and architecture and the built environment became a lifelong interest. It was hard more recently when we explained to Dad that he needed to move to Somerset, and he said, "But Ted McCoy designed this house for us. How can I leave this?" as the sun was filtering through the trees outside the windows. In late 1968, the whole family travelled to Melbourne, where Dad had study leave in the Department of Physiology at Monash University through 1969. We explored Melbourne and the Victorian countryside. I attended a local primary school. Janet and David were at high school, and men landed on the moon, which we were able to watch on television. So it was very exciting for me as a little 5-year-old. In late 1969, Mum and us children returned to Dunedin, and Dad continued his study leave with a round-the-world trip, which included a visit to Iran, where he astutely made some textile purchases for Mum. One small woven bag is currently in a display at the Otago Museum as part of the exhibition It's All in the Making, the Marjorie Blackman textile collection. Thanks to Maura White, who's here today. Dad continued his research and teaching in the Department of Pharmacology for the rest of his professional life. I accompanied Mum and Dad to Edinburgh in 1976, travelling through Iran, Turkey, Italy and Switzerland. Textile collecting was by this stage an important activity in that year, as were visits to many art galleries, historical sites in the UK, and many interesting and architecturally significant buildings. Further sabbatical leaves to London followed in 1983 and 1987. Janet was by this time living in Edinburgh in 1987, and so shared their wider travels to Europe. Grandson Michael James Blackman was born on the 23rd of January 1982 to David, our brother, and to Fiona Mackenzie. Dad was acting head of the department in 1990, and I'm not sure that he really enjoyed the demands of heading a department, but over the years he contributed to the wider university in many ways, and two things spring to mind. He was on the Hocken Pictures committee for a number of years, helping select artworks for purchase or addition to the Hocken collections, and he also contributed to the university embellishment collection with several paintings of his own. Dad also contributed to Mum's weaving and textile work, And for example, in the late 70s, hope I've got the date right, Mum, but Mum was invited to submit a design for a textile work to a competition for the beehive, which was being built then. Dad designed the work, Mum dyed the wool and wove samples. They submitted the work. They didn't win, but with some relief, as the real thing would have been absolutely huge and rather difficult to make. One sample was given to the university and hung in the registry for many years and is part of the university embellishment collection. Mum and Dad have recently given other samples and documentation of the project to the Hocken for exhibition in 2021. Another memory I have of the 80s was being a history student myself, and in the late 1980s I used to pop into Dad's office and used a spare Apple IIe to write my essays, with Dad offering editing feedback. Our family was devastated when, on the 20th of January 1989, our much-loved David died in a motorbike accident in Christchurch. And it was a dark time for us all, but I have memories of Dad comforting a 6-year-old Michael with cuddles and conversation when things got too much. Dad retired from pharmacology at the end of February 1995. All this time, art and photography continued, and I have many memories of Dad painting and drawing. Family trips and picnics usually featured frequent stops for photography, and I personally have several photos of Dad that I took of him taking a photo, because often that's all I saw. His personal notebooks are filled with small sketches and pasted in pieces of ephemera from travel. And I know Catherine Milburn, who's here, will attest to Dad's enthusiasm for collecting ephemera as well, much of which is now at the Hocken in the ephemera collections. And also from their travels, both Mum and Dad wrote many, many letters describing their travels, which we kept, and it has been really wonderful for Janet and myself to read these letters to Mum and Dad more recently. After retirement, an interest in history came to the fore, and Dad for many years researched and wrote a column for the North East Valley newsletter on the history of North East Valley. Originally there was to be a book, and I do remember George Griffiths getting quite frustrated that the book didn't seem to happen. But Dad never quite seemed satisfied with his research and writing, but he actually loved doing the research and writing for the column. There are copies of the column available at the Hocken now. Dad's photography became more and more recognised in these years, and his photography CV now extended to many pages with 9 or more solo exhibitions, several at Brett's Gallery in Dowling Street, and dozens of contributions to group and joint exhibitions. There were also numerous book illustrations that Dad did from time to time. Sometime after retirement, I recall Dad saying that he felt he was hardly known as a pharmacologist anymore, but now only as a photographer. I originally wrote that I thought that he didn't mind, but I'm not sure whether he minded or not, so I won't say that he minded, but it's interesting that that's how people see him now, I think. Travel continued in retirement, with trips overseas to Australia, North America, the UK and Europe, mainly visiting friends and family, searching out textiles, good art and interesting architecture. My son, the second grandson, Daniel Clayton, was born on the 7th of August 1999. Exhibitions of photography continued with the solo retrospective survey at the Dunedin Public Art Gallery in 2003, covering 50 years of his work. And to be honest, I still have the huge 2-storey banner for the show, and I'm not quite sure what to do with it because I think it's too big for the ephemera collection. Dad also loved typography and designed Mum's book on Dorothy Theomin, which was published in 2007, as well as many other booklets and posters for various groups that he was involved in throughout his life. I think his final book was the book Aspiring to Art, which was substantially based on his Matthew William Hodgkin's lecture to the Art Gallery Society in 2012. The book was published in 2014 and is a memoir of his life in art. Much to everyone's delight, great-grandson Matthew was born to Mike and Hazel on the 12th of March 2015. Dad was a wonderful husband and a soulmate to Mum, the best dad, granddad and great-granddad, a caring son to his parents Lance and Erna, and a friend to many, an artist, a photographer, a pharmacologist and much more. He was a natural teacher and he inspired us all to think and look and question the world around us. I am missing him very greatly, but his life was very well lived. It was a wonderful life, and I only have to think of that to find comfort. Thank you.
Kia ora koutou. Thank you very much, Anna. It was lovely to hear about the Valley Boys because my father, Boyne Galland, was one of the Valley Boys too. He was a few years older than Gary, but they knew each other and then went to Otago Boys too. So it must have been an idyllic time growing up in the North East Valley at that time. So.
Yeah, I think so.
So thank you very much, Janet, Anna, Marjorie and family for inviting me to speak today. It's a great honour to be able to talk at this memorial service in memory of Gary, who was a great mentor of mine in scientific research. So Gary was my PhD supervisor and he was hugely respected by many in many walks of life. So in speaking today, I'm also representing the Department of Pharmacology, but not as it is today, because I actually don't probably know anybody in the Department of Pharmacology at the moment. But back in the time in the late 1980s, when Gary was really a key player in the greater pharmacology family we had at the time, it was a really collegial environment, and the university was in fantastic shape at that time. So I joined Gary in his lab as his PhD student in 1985. He'd been awarded a research grant from the Medical Research Council, now known as the Health Research Council, and he put the word out that he was looking for someone to do some research on asthma as a junior research fellow in his department. And I was doing my honours in respiratory physiology at the time, and I was looking to do a PhD, possibly staying there, but he reached out to my supervisor and told her about this position that was becoming vacant. So I don't actually recall an interview, rather an expression of interest and a meeting with Gary, and it just kind of evolved from there. So it was actually wonderful for me. It was actually a win-win for me too, because I said I was planning to do a PhD, but I was also able to negotiate doing this on a full-time salary, which actually is really unheard of today. So I was really lucky at that time. My memories of that time was joining this thriving department that was doing extremely well in both teaching and research, and Gary was very much one of the key people in that department. Dick Laverty was head of the department, but I do recall that time when Gary took over as head of department, and I don't think he particularly enjoyed that admin role, but he had to step in at one stage. Everyone looked to Gary for advice about pretty much everything, really. He was hugely generous with his time, and I don't think he ever had a cross word to say about anybody or anything. I'm not sure actually how I got my PhD finished, because there were countless hours spent chatting with Gary. Whether it was a discussion about the piece of artwork that had gone up in the Dean's office that he either liked or didn't like, or what the town planner was next proposing in a design, and whether he agreed with that or not. It was discussed at length. And occasionally we would talk pharmacology, so we must have done some pharmacology at some stage, but we used to have great chats. So aside from pharmacology, he did teach me to have an appreciation of very fine things, whether it was the shape of the ballpoint pen he'd been given or the aesthetics of the glass vase he'd purchased for Marjorie. He certainly honed my interest in beautiful pieces of artwork or jewellery, many things that I can only gaze at in galleries and can't afford, but he had that eye for beautiful things, and I guess I picked up on that. He must have thought that I had some skills in colour or design at least, because he actually involved me in the choice of the colour for repainting the facades of the Adams building, which is where we worked at the time. This is, I think it was about a 6-storey building. We were on the 2nd floor. And I'm guessing about that time it was really important to actually start doing consultation around things rather than just deciding yourself. So he decided to consult with me in terms of the colour for this particular building. And we had numerous colour palettes, and green was actually the chosen colour. And we spent hours and hours going backwards and forwards on trying to settle on exactly which one. We did settle on a bottle green, but I can't remember when it was painted, but I remember walking down Pitt Street and seeing the building complete painted in this much brighter green than I'd actually thought that we had picked. And I kind of cringed, and I never really told Gary that I thought maybe we chose the wrong colour. And I felt responsible for that for years until they eventually changed the colour. I have no idea what it is today. I actually meant to have a look this morning, but I forgot. So during that pharmacology era, there was a great team of people like Barbara Logan, David Green, Murray Craig, who I think might be here today, Anil Rout, and the late Barbara Fakuri, Robert Purvis, and Dick Laverty are the key people that I remember. And we were a great team. We really were a family, Murray, don't you think, in pharmacology at that time. It was a wonderful, wonderful time in my career. So a central point on our floor, and it was literally central, was in the 2nd floor of the Adams building was this dark room that was Gary's for developing photos. Or it seemed like it was Gary's own. It was right in the middle of all the labs sort of was surrounded it. To this day, I actually have no idea of how he was able to combine his essentially outside of workplace passion for photography with having his very own darkroom inside of his workplace. There was a link with medicine though, so he offered photography as a medical elective for I think was the 5th year students. I can't quite recall the years, but they, I do recall the students actually really lining up. It was a really popular elective to do for the students. So on the research side, he taught me a great deal in terms of lab skills and knowledge of pharmacology, because I didn't have little when I came. I trained in physiology, so he taught me a lot around that, and I did one of his courses as well, and he was certainly a really good teacher. And he also taught me a really systematic approach to research inquiry and the practice of research. A story I often relay about Gary that links to my career is the publication of my very first paper. I would have probably written the first draft, and then as you do, you pass it on to your supervisor for comment and editing. I can't remember how much work he did on it, but I recall that it was quite a long time between my first attempt and then when we did the final submission. There would have been a few drafts in between. So the paper was submitted to the British Journal of Pharmacology, which is a reasonably prestigious journal, certainly at that time. And for most papers to be accepted in a journal, it usually takes at least 1 or 2 rounds of review and changes before it's accepted. But incredibly, this paper was accepted on the first submission, no changes, which is practically unheard of. In fact, it's never happened to me since, and I don't know too many people that it has. But today, I really put this down to Gary's ability to craft the written text of that paper to perfection, and that was Gary's trademark in whatever he did and created. Gary obviously spent a lot of time talking to me about his family. I always knew what Anna and David and Janet were up to in their lives, and then later Fiona and Michael. I would see Marjorie often, as she was always popping into the lab. I'm not quite sure, you were often in town doing things in and out of places, and I saw a lot of Marjorie over those years. Gary's face would literally light up when he talked about Marjorie's work. her artwork rather. He was enormously proud of her work, and I particularly remember him telling me about the textiles that were to be placed in the foyer of Dunedin Public Hospital. I absolutely loved those colours and design of those pieces in that foyer, and they were really exquisite, and I don't think that they are there now, and I don't know where they are, but it'd be nice to find out. They are? They're still in the foyer?
Yes.
Okay.
They're framed behind glass.
Right.
Protection.
Okay. They are just beautiful. The colours are just my colours, absolutely. So I really lost touch with Gary over the later years, particularly after he retired, but my memories of the hours and hours of chats with him will never be forgotten. Knowing that he had a wonderful and very fulfilling and very long life, enriched by his family and his love of the arts, and especially photography, with some pharmacology in the mix, provides me some peace, and I'm forever grateful for having been mentored by Gary in my research career. To Gary's family, I know you'll miss him enormously. He was such a generous and talented person and great family man, and he was enormously fond of all of you. I do know through that many hours of chats around that. So now I'm just going to read to you a tribute from David Green. David was one of the senior lecturers in the pharmacology department, and he was a bit of a character, I must say, for those of you, some of you may know Gary. Gary and David would just often feed off each other in their conversation. They were in adjoining labs, and the banter would just go on and on, usually David getting louder and louder, and Gary's voice rising a little bit, but it was just classic times. So this from David, Gary Blackman, an appreciation. I have been asked to speak about Gary at work in my capacity as a former colleague. Gary spent the greater part of his career as a staff member of the Department of Pharmacology in the University of Otago Medical School. I happened to occupy the office next door to Gary's for 17 years, a random but for me fortuitous allocation. I would see him almost every day during term time, often more than once, and for several hours at a time during practical classes. Those were the days when video was in its infancy, computers were effectively non-existent, and animals were used for experiments in practical classes. I experienced his teaching and research at close quarters. All subjects had their core material in the peripheries, but pharmacology is unusual because its core is an approximately equal marriage of two very different disciplines, physiology and chemistry. It was standard practice 50 years or so ago to graduate in one of the two and to learn the other half on the job. It certainly was in my case, but Gary, 15 years older than myself, always seemed to have a seamless knowledge of all aspects of pharmacology. He also had a deep conviction, rightly so, of its importance in providing intellectual coherence to the use of medications and the treatment of illness. To a novice like me, he was a wonderful example to follow, as well as an endless source of advice. Oops, sorry, I'm just have to go back and Yep, sorry. It was an endless source of advice and wisdom. If I had to create a word cloud for Gary, it would contain words such as teaching, research, professionalism, erudition, commitment, diligence, courtesy, patience, humour, and many more. He was endlessly patient in getting important ideas across to students and gentle but firm in correcting mistakes. The organisation of his office was very characteristic. Like me, he believed in using every surface for storage, but unlike me, he built stable, almost architectural piles of books. He did too. But David's office was an absolute chaos, so it was a complete contrast. He also built them at his house in Bravia Crescent, and this conveniently leads me into some of his other interests, starting with photography. The Department of Pharmacology had not long moved from the Adams into the Adams building when I arrived in 1978, and Gary had had a hand in some of its internal design. Not surprisingly, therefore, there was a small, well-equipped dark room just outside his office laboratory on the second floor. I wish now I'd taken a picture of his office as it was in those days, but I didn't. I've been trying to reconstruct in my mind for this appreciation. Several of Gary's photographs have become iconic images of a New Zealand now largely gone. The first being his 6 o'clock closing of the Robert Burns Hotel in George Street, but the two photos that I remember in his room were the one of the old man with a spoked handcart in Cumberland Street. I'm guessing he took it around 1955, and one of his photographs of New Zealand war memorials, the one at Kaikoura with a seagull slightly out of focus flying past the monument. He was a gifted painter and printmaker, a keen supporter of the Bosch Art Gallery in its glory days, the New Zealand Symphony Orchestra, where he had a friend who gave him the lowdown on what was going on behind the scenes, the Hocken Library, and lots of other things besides. As a result, my working environment was immeasurably richer on a daily basis, and for that I shall always regard myself as incredibly fortunate and immensely grateful. My wife, Sarah Rees, and I were early rewarded with the Blackman's immense kindness within a day or two of our arrival in New Zealand from a wintry northern hemisphere. We were taken by Marjorie and Gary for a picnic with our two children at Evansdale on Waitangi Day. One of our first exposures to the strange landscape of New Zealand. Marjorie and Gary were firmly established in our affections even before I entered the Adams building. An appreciation of Gary would be incomplete without proper reference to Marjorie, whose independent activities were also broad and creative. Marjorie is a noted weaver, an authority on Māori cloaks, and an authority on the conservation of woven artefacts. They seem to us to be mutually kindred spirits, supporting each other in their respective endeavours. So a word cloud for Marjorie and Gary together might read as follows: weaving, photography, Ulverston, conservation, the built environment, the McCoy House and Braveview Crescent, New Zealand wine, and so on. A shared life of great depth, love, and mutual respect. David Green from France. Thank you.
Right. I'm going to read you a poem, and this is a poem that I read at our small family funeral that we had at the time that Dad died. But some of David Green's comments are very pertinent to the subject of the poem. And also, fortuitously, David and his wife Sarah were in Dunedin and visited Mum and Dad a week before Dad died, so that was very special. The poem is written by a fairly well-known English poet, Anthony Thwaite, who was a friend of Marjorie and Gary. And this was from the last book of his, which he, of collection of poems, which was published, I think, about 10 years ago. Anthony died about a year before Dad did. So the poem is called Questions. Shall I begin with the papers on my desk, the papers on my bed, the papers on the floor, or the books tilting over on the very top shelf, or the books on the stairs, or the books on my desk? Or shall I get on with the antiquarian scraps silting up on the sill, or in boxes on the floor, or the cabinet drawers, or behind the cupboard door, or still to be found in cupboards I've forgotten, or stuffed into corners of the shed or the barn, or elbowed into somewhere altogether elsewhere, or piles piled up in pillars of papers, unsteady in my head as I try to begin to sort the papers on the desk, on the bed, on the floor, and shift them a little and open the door. Any of you who knew Braveview Crescent and knew my father, that is just him. Thank you.
Thank you for this opportunity to highlight some of Gary's creative legacy. I first met Gary at Otago Medical School in 1971 when he was Associate Professor of Pharmacology. At the time, I was not aware of his interest in art, but more recently he told me that he illustrated his pharmacology lectures with break sessions using some of his photographs. So I thought that was good, and obviously he went on and had students could study photography sessions. In his photography CV, he writes with characteristic humility, from the early 1950s, active as a committed amateur, in drawing, painting, printmaking, photography, and having seen the slides, I'd also say the art of bonsai. In constructing my notes, I've woven together some recent pieces on Gary by Athol McCready, Te Papa's curator of photographs, and Peter Ireland, an artist, critic, and photography historian. When Gary discovered photography as a form of personal expression in the early 1950s, and that's the date to remember, he was well ahead of his time, too far ahead, in fact, for there was little context in New Zealand for his work then. This point's exemplified by some features in recent publications around the re-release of Robin Morrison's The South Island from the Road, 1981. And in 1979, the Morrison family set out on this project. The timing was good, photography was hot, all the bright young things studying art at university were choosing photography over painting, etc. So there was this delay almost of, or Gary was ahead of his time, we would say, by nearly 30 years with regard to photography. As you'll know, Gary delivered the William Matthew Hodgkins Memorial Lecture in 2012 to the Dunedin Public Art Gallery Society, and he chose his title, Aspiring to Art, as a frame for my view of the world as of art I grew into here in Dunedin in the 1940s to the 1970s. So I think that title's very appealing. This lecture clearly demonstrates Gary's fluency in international and national art history. So he brought to photography a deep understanding of art, and just looking at one of the works hanging in the gallery this morning, I was very taken with this work and how it demonstrated the power of photography. His father was a notable pictorialist photographer and member of the Dunedin Photographic Society, from whom he learnt the techniques of the medium. But the rule-based system of judging photographs in the society held no interest for Gary. Instead, he found some pointers in different possibilities in a handful of books, Eugene Atget's photographs, a photographic documentation of Paris, and Bill Brandt's 1948 Camera in London. Gary attended, there's a little overlap here now with Anna's piece, because I've followed sort of a biographic lineage here. Gary attended art classes at the School of Art, where he, when presided over by the innovative and pioneering Gordon Tovey, taking his first photographs when later attending Otago Boys High School. The school journal in the 1940s quickened his interest in the look of New Zealand and in an art world he was just beginning to notice. In his university student years, 1948 to 53, he began taking photographs with some serious intent. He admired the work of modern US photographers like Ansel Adams, Edward West, and Paul Strand, being published in camera annuals. In the early 1950s, he used a small 35mm camera to record his vacation experiences. For example, as a rouseabout working on sheep farms in the pig root and hide, as mentioned by Anna. After World War II, he came to photography through international magazines and at the Dunedin Public Library, but initially worked largely in isolation, right up to the late 1960s, mid-1970s, when the idea of contemporary photography began emerging in New Zealand, and the Photo Forum generation embraced his work, which was included in the seminal nationally touring Active Eye exhibition throughout 1975-76, which included Lake Mahinarangi, which I think you'll see on the screen soon, a beautifully understated image of windblown tussock contrasted with sparkling light on ruffled water. This poignant work reminds me of a definition of photography. A photograph is an event transformed into an object, the fixing of light in space over time. A period overseas, which has been referred to, 1959 to 62 in Edinburgh as a research fellow, gave him fresh eyes for the Victorian architecture of Dunedin. This led to the book with architect Ted McCoy, Victorian City of New Zealand, 1968. It was around this period that he began to see how photography could creatively substitute for painting and drawing. One of the significant values of Blackman's oeuvre is just how it connects to the photographic tradition. He's been documenting all along in a kind of history of photographic practice. Justin Payton's 2003 Gary Blackman Survey exhibition in this gallery deserved to be seen elsewhere, but unfortunately it didn't travel. Gary took the processes and innovations of photographic practice and the change from analog to digital in his stride. He used computerized distortions to achieve his ends, and he had an early love affair with Polaroid from the 1970s. The thread holding this work together was the formalism of modernism, but his roving eye was always alert to sly humour, which shows up most often in his street photography in some of the markets. Photographers and some other artists frequently become known for a small number of particular images, and this has been the case for Gary. But spending 2 days at Braveview Crescent, at the Braveview Crescent family home with Anna, looking through his archive, reinforced my regard for the depth and range of his practice. Visiting Gary and Marjorie at Somerset at Bishop Court with Anna on the 8th of October and showing Gary the 19 prints we'd selected for consideration by the Auckland Art Gallery was a real treat. A key attribute of looking at photographs is their ability to restore the fragmentary nature of memory. Gary became particularly animated in revisiting these early 1950s prints and recalled in detail his treks between the 2 pig country farms he was working on, Peddies near Hyde and Isla Downs, using a fence line as the only navigational aid. He also endorsed the plan we had for these prints, so it was very timely. I'm working with Julia Waite at Auckland Art Gallery. She's a curator of New Zealand art, and she wrote to me about 10 days ago, and I'll quote, "I still find it enormously inspiring the way that the culture can produce the likes of Gordon Walters, Richard Killeen and Gary Blackman. I include Gary in this group because his work continues a similar understated sophistication which feels utterly genuine." And I think that's an appropriate note to finish on. Thank you.
I'm just going to read a tribute from Emeritus Professor Charlotte Paul. Charlotte lives in Wellington these days and couldn't be here today. Thank you for asking me to say some words about Gary Blackman. Thank you to the family of this remarkable man. I can't really believe Gary ever got old. He was youthful when he retired and for a long time after. I'm a peripheral figure in Gary's life, though he was always important to me. Gary taught me pharmacology at the Otago Medical School in the 1960s. When I was a junior doctor in London in the early 1970s, I knew that I had been well educated in pharmacology because I was told that I was more informed and more questioning than the local London graduates. Yet I was a desultory student. My real memories of Gary from that time are of his lab in the ground floor of the Welcome building, because my sometime boyfriend Robert Purvis did a Bachelor of Medical Science with Gary. I looked up their publication from that year, published in the Journal of Physiology, Electrophysiological Studies of Nerve Conduction. I have a feeling, me, Anna Blackman, I have a feeling that was to do with frogs, because there was always an aquarium full of frogs in that office. Anyway, back to Charlotte. I recall Gary talking at his retirement function about the fun of that year, including turning lab equipment into musical instruments. I remember his warm smile and his enthusiasm. In those early days, my student friend Gwyn Somerville and I bought Victorian City of New Zealand, published by Mackintosh in 1968, with Gary's beautiful clear and spare photographs of Dunedin early buildings. It helped me come to love Dunedin. Later, from the early 1980s, we were colleagues at the medical school, both in the Adams building. We would see each other at the building's only photocopying machine on the 5th floor, I think. Gary even asked to take some photos of me at work. I hate having my photo taken, but these were good spare photos. Then, much later, around 1996, when Gary retired, I got to see him every week. Again, I was peripheral to the friendship between Gary and my husband, Kevin Cunningham. Kevin had worked as the McNabb librarian at the public library before being struck down by multiple sclerosis in the 1980s, and by 1996 Kevin could no longer read and was largely paralysed. He loved books, and especially poetry, his greatest source of nourishment. And from the time Gary retired, he came to our house each Saturday morning with a thin sheaf of books, new and old poetry and other things. They sat in the kitchen and Gary read to Kevin and they talked. I don't know exactly what they read, and this was precious time for me to do other things, though we all talked together too about progress on Gary's history of North East Valley, amid other things. And I have found mention of his history notes column in the Valley Voice. Kevin's eyes lit up when Gary appeared every week, so I think about Gary's generosity in reading to Kevin and his care and interest in words and poetry. Vanessa Manhire, who lived with us as a student in one of those years, remembers him fondly, always turning up in a shirt and tie. This remarkable man, whose spare visual sensibility extended from photography to painting, to the house in Braveview Crescent that he and Marjorie made, to his clothes. I moved to Wellington 10 years ago, so saw Marjorie and Gary less often, and I wrote to him last July in the hope that we could have a special meal in honour of Kevin to mark 20 years since he died. Gary had attended the last dinner at a small Asian restaurant in Princes Street to celebrate Kevin's 57th birthday with all his regular visitors and friends. But COVID put a stop to the dinner planned for last year. Thank you.
I'd just like to reiterate Anna's thanks to all of you for coming here today. It's amazing to see such a lovely crowd, and also huge thank you to the Dunedin Public Art Gallery for hosting this event. I have been anticipating this day with some trepidation for a number of years. When somebody gets to the age of 90, you realise that they may not be with you for that much longer. What would I say about my wonderful father at his funeral? How do you do justice to such a long and remarkable life? How do you talk about all his interests and passions and achievements in just a few minutes? Thankfully, you can share that task with others who were a part of his life, who can talk about some areas in more depth. So thank you for everyone else who's contributed so far. I realised that I could simply talk about being his daughter, the memories and the ongoing influence he has on my life. I will touch briefly on some of the many things that have enriched his life and that he shared with me. I feel extremely fortunate to have been Gary's daughter. He was a kind, gentle and inspiring father to me, David and Anna, and a proud grandfather to Michael, Daniel and Matthew. There was no doubt we were very much loved. The loss of his only son, David, at the age of 31 was a deep blow for all of us, but especially for his young son, Michael, and Gary and Marjorie. Of course, he was also a devoted and loving husband to Marjorie for over 67 years. They were such a team, true soulmates with so many shared interests and achievements. It is so hard for Mum now to have lost her darling Gary. Some of my first memories are of being read to as a small child, mostly from classic English children's books such as the Oxford Nursery Rhyme Book, Beatrix Potter and Edward Lear. They were beautifully illustrated, often with simple or quirky drawings which aligned with Gary's artistic tastes. He couldn't resist buying the interesting children's books which were appearing in the 1960s, so they provided the bulk of our Christmas and birthday presents. Later, we were delighted in his reading aloud of the Tintin books, complete with different voices for each character. Captain Haddock and his thundering typhoons and bashy bazooks was a favourite. He was a natural teacher and was always happy to share his enthusiasms for a wide range of subjects, as many other people have mentioned. This was a great help with homework problems. He was always happy to discuss and point you to a solution. The extensive collection of books in our house was a useful resource in those pre-internet days. Gary had kept books from his own childhood and student days, which he obviously treasured. Some of these he had made dust jackets for, which were illustrated with his own drawings and beautiful lettering. As a schoolboy, he had discovered the world of art, photography and architecture through the Dunedin Public Library, which must have been very exciting for a boy in a small city at the bottom of the world. He studied his art on his own when at Otago Boys High School, as art was not offered as a subject to the academic streams. At that time, I think he saw himself as a bit of an outsider with his interests in art and culture rather than team sports, and as a university student, he would not have been into rugby and beer. He seemed quite comfortable with being a bit different and following his own path, which I admired him for. There is no doubt that the fact that he was on the staff of the medical school was a major factor in my choice of career. Over dinner, he would talk about the interesting people who were medical students, and that sounded fun to me and suited my leaning to the sciences. Fortunately, being a doctor turned out to be a good thing for me too. Grandson Michael says that Gary also inspired his career as a software developer. Gary had a computer at home before many people did, and Michael enjoyed playing on his early Macintosh desktop. I think Michael also benefited from Gary's practical advice and support when he was studying computer science at Otago. Walking with Dad was a pleasure and an opportunity to talk. We didn't have a car until I was 11 or 12, so walking was a regular thing. I have fond memories of walking with him to school in Edinburgh when I was 5, and the exciting day when we walked on the frozen canal instead of over the bridge, a special treat. Later, when I was at university, we would walk down the hill together to the medical school. Dad walked to work for most of his working life, and sometimes also up the hill home. That and all the stairs at home kept him fit and healthy until the last few years of his life. In his early 20s, he had done tramping and climbing, but that stopped with fatherhood. The only tramp I did with him was in 1982, when I was to do the Milford with some friends. One of the party had to pull out at short notice, and Dad stepped in at the last moment. I was a bit anxious about how my he was only 52, father would cope, but he did fine with his old canvas pack and, of course, camera around his neck at all times. On the last day, he took a tumble forwards, badly bruising and grazing both knees. To his relief, the camera was saved by the piece of string tied around his chest, securing it from hitting the rocks. One of the great pleasures in my life is listening to classical music. I was exposed to this from infancy, and Dad and I would always try and work out who the composer was and what the music was when listening to the radio. Gary and Marjorie were both long-term subscribers to New Zealand and Dunedin Symphony Orchestras and Chamber Music New Zealand, as I have been too. And in recent years, they were delighted to have their grandson Daniel attend concerts with them. During the last years of Gary's life, once he and Marjorie were living at Somerset, Anna's already mentioned that we enjoyed reading the letters and diaries from the travels that we had shared with them. In 1983, they were in London for 6 months on sabbatical, and I was working in Edinburgh at the time. Edinburgh, of course, had a very special place in all our hearts, with Marjorie and Gary having lived there on 2 occasions, and in 1983 I was at the beginning of another 4 years living in Edinburgh. I would like to read you a passage from Gary's diary of October 1983, describing their departure after a final weekend in Edinburgh before they were returning to New Zealand. They had been staying with their dear friends, the Ginsborgs, in Magdala Crescent, Edinburgh. The scene is at Waverley Station. I think it succinctly reflects some of his passions. Poignantly, this was the last page I read to them a few days before Dad died. So this is Dad's words. I stepped down to the station with no more than a glance at the turreted skyline I was leaving behind. To my surprise, Marjorie turned up with Janet, who had got home early from work in time to collect Marjorie from Magdala Crescent. It was not possible for Janet to park her car. We kissed and said goodbye again. I sensed in her expression that she was feeling the wrench of departure. She also perhaps will leave Edinburgh with the same sense of separation that we have felt. It is remarkable that man-made structures and their settings can so stir emotions. Places have the power to evoke memories, or rather aspirations. Places like Edinburgh, their spaces, vistas and buildings, which have excited the imagination, are crystallised in the mind by absence into something more Arcadian, more classical, more romantic. To return to a place idealised in the mind is often to be disappointed, but not so with Edinburgh on this occasion. Edinburgh has the power to evoke the qualities of an ideal city even while you are there. And I know that Edinburgh was, I think, Dad's favourite city. I will finish by just reiterating how lucky I was to have a father like Gary. He will remain with me every day when I listen to wonderful music, look at art, or take a photograph. What a legacy I have. So I think that's everything. Thank you.
I just want to say thank you so much to all of the people that have come up to the podium and shared their personal memories and love for Gary. It's been a privilege to have listened to you. Now's the time when the opportunity exists for anyone else who would like to come up and share some brief memories or thoughts with us. The opportunity is yours now. I guess I just want to conclude by saying that Gary, I didn't know Gary that well, but he was always someone with Marjorie who I really enjoyed speaking to at openings, so friendly and so pleasant to spend time with. And like so many of the other speakers today, I think about Gary a lot too, and I do so because I am a resident of Braveview Crescent and have the good fortune of living a little bit up the hill, and I stare down on that beautiful Ted McCoy house that Gary and Marjorie commissioned, and I am very thankful that that's my view. I think that's where we're going to leave it. On behalf of the family, I'd like to thank you all for coming, and I would invite you to make your way up to the ODT gallery, which is on the top floor, where we have some refreshments for you. Thank you.
Nice talk, but I'm not just getting old.
And then there's quite a lot of sky transports as well. So it's quite a canyon. It's really just